Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we complete a 4-day program on the challenges of democracy and governance in the United States. This is a theme that we have spent a lot of time contemplating over the last several years as it's become clear, given events in the United States with Donald Trump and the Republican Party seeking to essentially eviscerate the democratic process and the enabling of people to vote in states all across the country, that we were really facing a coup in a very fundamental way, and that our democracy was at stake. We know that climate change is a code red issue. So is democracy, and not only in the United States, but also in countries around the world as we experience a rising tide of authoritarianism. The last election in 2022 seemed to stave off the attempts at the subversion of democracy. There is still a long way to go. And so over the last several days, we've been listening to people who are quite literally on the front lines in state after state in the United States that are organizing for the 2024 election. We've heard from a number of people that that is even more consequential than 2022. And so we at Humanity Rising are supporting these voices and supporting these activities in every way we can. And that is to give them airtime in our global broadcast, to encourage them to move forward and to support them in any way that they need as we both inspire, but at Humanity Rising, we also encourage people to take action, because faith without works is dead, particularly in a situation of code red. We'll get into our program in a moment, but before we do, let us just pause and take a few breaths together. In a moment, you'll hear the sound of a bell. For those of you who are new, when you hear the bell, just breathe in slowly for about 5.5 seconds. Then you'll hear another bell and just exhale for about 5.5 seconds. The slower you breathe, the more your system is brought into coherence. And we'll take about 10 breaths together, and then we'll begin our program. So welcome, everyone. Let us breathe together. Thank you, everyone. You may have noted the icon that we put up while we breathe together, just for your information. That's the picture of what the combined orbital pathways of the Earth and Venus depict as they circumambulate the sun. They form a 5-pointed star. The number of Venus is 5. And many of the ancient goddesses had the number 5. So when you're breathing in and you're breathing out, you're replicating how we orbit the sun, and you're breathing in and you're breathing out the divine feminine. It's an extraordinary way to center ourselves each day on Humanity Rising. So thank you all. It's my pleasure now to introduce my good friends and colleagues, George Caponelli, the founder of Age Nation, and John Steiner and Margot King, who are networkers par excellence, and both George, John, and Margot, and all the people they brought on our programs over the last several years have been passionate about democracy, which is the essential ingredient to solving any of the other problems that we have facing us. So George, John, I want to thank you once again for a marvelous program, and I turn the session over to you.
Thanks, Jim. As always, welcome everyone for this 4th day in the democracy governance. We've added governance to the word.
George, excuse me. My video is having trouble. I'm going to go out and come back in again.
Okay.
Give me a second, John.
All right.
There we go.
Thank you, George.
Good morning again. And we've had a great 3 days. And if you haven't had the ability or taken the time to watch the first 3 programs, we really encourage you, because as Jim said, what we do on the Democracy Governance Dialogues is we bring people on who are making a difference in this time and who are determining the well-being of our future to the best of their ability. Every time we do one of these programs, last year we were focused on the midterms, encouraging, inviting, organizing, stimulating people to get out and exercise their right to vote, even against a number of different odds. Now we recognize that the picture has changed somewhat as a result of that midterm election, but we are still in a condition of what I call in extremis as a nation. The term comes from the nautical language, which advises the crew and the captain of a ship that's in danger of capsizing, colliding, or running aground, to abandon some of the traditional rules and do whatever is necessary to save the ship. And considering the immediacy of a lot of the challenges we face, what Jim refers to as code red challenges, and we know them, there are many, from climate to inequality and the attacks on democracy and the war in Ukraine and so many other things. We have an obligation, I believe, as citizens to not just vote with our ballots, but to vote with our dollars, to vote with our time and attention, to vote in the many ways we can legally protest and raise our voices. Because if we don't, it's not just that democracy will suffer, and with it so many other things, but the well-being of humanity, the well-being of the other species, the well-being of this planet, all get put in jeopardy. So I believe we have an obligation as individuals to exercise our rights, to declare our sovereignty, and not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us, and for those who are not yet even in line to come after us. We have that obligation. And so I hope we consider that, each and every one of us, as we listen to our guests today, and we realize how important they're doing to make a difference. John?
Thank you, George. George, beautiful introduction, and you as well, Jim. Let me invite Leah and John and Ken to come on. And I am waiting for John here. There we go. It is really a privilege and an honor to have the three of you. I'm going to be brief with our intros this morning because we have a lot to talk about. Leah Greenberg is the co-founder and co-director of Indivisible, and a remarkable woman, particularly because she has agreed to join us being 8 months pregnant. And she's just about to take her maternity leave. As she said, she's got a 2.5-year-old at home who's very excited about this. So Leah, welcome back. It is really good to have you again. Please tell Ezra we're not discriminating. And we look forward to having him on again as well. John Brakey has been a knowledgeable, passionate, pragmatic stalwart for free and fair, transparent, clean, audited elections in this country, almost like no one else, and certainly part of an amazing team that's done so with remarkable work, as we'll hear about in Arizona and around the country. So, John, welcome from a seat you're sitting in that's probably not too warm at the moment, but it's known to be a little hot down there in lots of ways.
Well, thank you for having us. And yeah, I am known for being passionate, and I've spent 18 years on this quest. And
we look forward to hearing about it, sir.
Good.
Ken, it is really a privilege to have you. Ken is the former Secretary of State of Arizona as a Republican. He's a member as a Republican of the state Senate and has a bipartisan passion for changing how we hold and do and make transparent elections in this country, but in a way that anyone can say that's fair. And that's been the challenge in terms of the arguments on both sides of the aisle. So while we understand this bill before Arizona that we're going to hear about could have been partisan, John, you and Ken have made sure that when it passes, it's going to be bipartisan and a model for the country. So, George, I'm going to welcome to all five of us. And George, I'm going to turn this back over to you to ask the first question.
Thanks, John. So as we've talked about, we love the dialogue format, and so we're going to have a lot of opportunity to interact with one another. But if each of you, Leah, let's begin with you, will take a few minutes to talk about where you see things at this moment. Maybe mention a little bit about what you've done to get us here in the last midterm. And we'll each do that for a brief period of time, and then we'll engage with one another and turn up the heat, okay? Yeah.
Wonderful. Sure. Absolutely. And if I could provide just a little bit of context on Indivisible as an organization and a movement in our history, just for the context for those observations. Yeah. So we as a movement got started shortly after the election of Donald Trump in 2016. My husband and I, Ezra Levin, who's also my co-executive director now, wrote a short guide to organizing locally in order to use congressional advocacy to try and stop the upcoming Trump agenda. We were stunned when that guide that we had put on the internet went viral and led to the formation of thousands of local Indivisible groups around the country. Right at this point, there are around 2,700 Indivisible groups all over the country in every state, which are largely local community volunteer groups, the people who are dedicated to resisting Trump and the MAGA movement, and ultimately promoting a more just and inclusive democracy that is fair and where we can all thrive. We have gone through a lot over the last 6 years together, and had a lot of moments of kind of trying to come up against a hard political reality or the consensus about what was politically possible at the time, and then try to outdo that. And I really think that 2022, our reflection coming out of 2022 is that that happened once again. I think it's really important to level set about where we were in historical, political, kind of standard expectation terms heading into the midterms, right? President's party almost always loses seats, usually loses a disastrous number of seats in a midterm. The most recent series that we have seen have involved not only kind of losses at the federal level, but also some really, really hard and painful losses at state levels that set us up for very damaging longer term dynamics in terms of who controls the levers of power there. I'm thinking of 2010, right, where major Tea Party wave also translated into a redistricting process that nearly put the House out of the reach for another 5 years. That didn't happen. It's also hard to go into a midterm with inflation at the level that it is. The economy in the place that it is, most people pessimistic about the overall state of the economy. All of those things set up for a pretty challenging dynamic heading into 2022. And our folks knew that. And also what we saw pretty consistently throughout the midterms was that this wasn't actually just going to be a referendum on President Biden. There was an opportunity for all of us to make this a referendum, not just on the party in power, but also on the threat of the MAGA extremist movement to our rights, to our freedoms, to our way of life, and our benefits, and to our democracy ultimately itself. And what we saw was that in the places where that argument happened, where that narrative really took hold, where that was what was at stake, there was a real penalty. A lot of voters, not necessarily people who consider themselves core Democrats, not necessarily people who consider themselves Biden fans, ultimately came over to our side because they recognized that, there are some core values at stake here that supersede the political arguments, right? Because they were turned off by the attack on abortion rights. They were turned off by the holding hands with election deniers and criminal conspiracists of January 6th. They were concerned about putting power in the hands of people who were closely affiliated with a movement that they perceived as extremist and radical and dangerous for our values. Did we win everything? No, absolutely not. We ultimately did not successfully get the House, but we came vastly closer than we expected. We expanded our margins in the Senate. And most importantly, all of the election deniers who were up in swing states for really pivotal roles that would have put them in control of election infrastructure. Sorry, I should say at the state level, there were a bunch of weirdos elected at the sub-state level. All the folks who are at the state level who were, openly running on campaigns to conduct elections in ways that would favor or turn the elections over to Republicans in the swing states were defeated, right? Some in some really, you would prefer that everyone be roundly defeated in every situation. There are a couple of squeakers in there. But fundamentally, what we saw was a pretty deep rejection of this kind of rhetoric, these conspiracy theories, and these threats to our democracy. And that's really exciting because that means that it's something that we can build on collectively going forward, right? There is a coalition of people who we can tap into and activate where we can convince them that this is the central story. This is what is happening in this country. Who will actually come along behind the kind of inclusive, multiracial, pluralistic democracy that we are ultimately trying to advance. And so that's a really hopeful sign for us. And it's something that we're integrating into our strategy going forward.
Thank you very much, Leah. Ken, you bring a wealth of experience that we do not necessarily have, most of us. So tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and how you are positioning this conversation.
George, thank you for having me. I kind of have a dual life. I've been a businessman and run a family business for the better part of 30 some years. Our family business is 85 years old here in North Central Arizona. But I also got into a public service career as early as 24 years old, got elected to my local community city council. Later served on the State Board of Education, was in the state Senate from 1999 to 2007, and the last 4 of those 8 years as president of the Senate. And then rather unexpectedly in 2009, was appointed Secretary of State for the state of Arizona because Janet Napolitano, our governor, who I worked with closely when I was the Republican president of the Senate. She resigned to go on to President Obama's cabinet, as you know. And in Arizona, the number 2 position is the Secretary of State. So Jan Brewer ascended to the governor's office. I became the Secretary of State. And I became kind of the figurehead, I guess, of the elections family in Arizona, and spent 6 years trying to make sure that our elections in Arizona are free and fair, and a bunch of other words that I was learning on the go. And then I started hearing about an organization in Tucson, in particular, a gentleman who's also on the call with us today, John Brakey. And at first, I didn't hear very good things about John, because John was scrutinizing elections in the large southern part of the state, Pima County, the Tucson area. And sometimes when your work is being looked at, people can get nervous or whatever. And so I heard the rumblings through the election family of Arizona that, who are these people down in Tucson that have the audacity to ask us whether our elections are being done transparently? Can they be tracked? Can they be publicly verified? Can we audit them? But as I have got to know John over the last 13 years, even though John is a progressive Democrat and I'm a conservative Republican, we might not agree on many of the same people as to whom we would vote for, but we agree 1,000% on one thing, and that is our elections have to be transparent, trackable, and publicly verifiable. And so in my world, as a state senator, we start every day with the Pledge of Allegiance, and we pledge our allegiance to a flag and the republic that it represents. And the most important thing, or one of the most important things to me in a republic, is that the people have to have confidence that the choices they made as to who is going to fill those positions of public leadership and service are the real people they picked. And the winners need to know that they won. And maybe even more importantly, the losers need to know that they lost. And so in the last couple of cycles, 2020 and 2022, we have kind of been in the middle of how do we deal with making sure that people have confidence in their elections. And most of it's coming, most of the skepticism and denialism, or whatever you want to call it, has been coming from my party for the last couple of cycles. That's not exclusive, though. It doesn't have to always be that way. I mean, there were people that were skeptical as to did what really happened in 2016 really happen? Or why did it happen? Or did it happen with outside undue influence? Anyway, so yes, John and I were involved in the audit of the Maricopa County election in 2020, which is the largest county in Arizona. And we became brothers in a foxhole with no more intent than just to make sure that the truth came out. And the truth did come out, and people still denied it. I sat in front of congressional oversight committees and said that, yes, based on what we looked at in the Maricopa County audit, Joe Biden won Arizona in 2020 by less than 11,000 votes. And then I find myself in the Senate 2 years later. And as John and I have worked together, we've come up with an idea. It's reflected in 2 bills in the Arizona legislature this year, one in the Senate Bill 1324, and another one in the House, identical in the House, 2560. And these bills call for, every time we have an election in Arizona, we think 4 fundamental pieces of information should be shared with the public by the counties that conduct these elections. In Arizona, the state does not conduct the elections. Each county conducts an election. In Arizona, we have 15 counties, 2 very large ones. Maricopa County accounts for more than 60% of the population in our state. Pima County accounts for about 20% of the population, and the other 13 counties account for the remaining less than 20%. So we have some very small counties. We've got a county, Greenlee, that probably has about 8,000 voters. We've got Maricopa County with 2.6 million voters. But the counties conduct the election, and these bills call for 4 pieces of information to be released every time that we have an election, so that our elections can be transparent, trackable, and publicly verified. The first piece of information is just a simple list of who was eligible to vote in the election. In Arizona, we cut off registration 29 days before an election. So we know 29 days before an election who's eligible to vote in that election. And the first list is just tell us who's on that list. That's before the election. After the election come the other 3 pieces of information. And the next one is, after the election was conducted, who voted? In almost the identical format as the first list. There should be no one on the second list of who voted that wasn't on the first list. And between those 2 lists, we can verify that nobody is either registered or voting more than 1 time each. The third piece of information are the ballot images. These are anonymous. Ballot images do not show who cast that ballot. But when a paper ballot goes through a machine, and 98% of the ballots that we use in Arizona are paper ballots, when they go through a machine, it takes a picture of that ballot, and all the processing that the election management system does is from that image. So the third thing that our bill calls for is to release the ballot images. There should be 1 ballot image for every 1 person on the who voted list. No more, no less. Now we have eliminated the wonder or concern or skepticism that there's ballots coming in from somewhere else that weren't authorized, but release the ballot images. And the fourth thing is publish what's called the cast vote record. The cast vote record is essentially a spreadsheet on which the votes from each ballot were recorded and then added up. A spreadsheet has rows and it has columns. Each row on the cast vote record corresponds with a ballot. So if you have the image of ballot 192, you can find row 192 on the cast vote record. And John's, I think, scrolling through a bunch of documents here to kind of show you maybe what a cast vote record looks like. But if you have the ballot images and the cast vote record, each row on the cast vote record corresponds to a ballot. And then the columns on the cast vote record are the choices that voters had on their ballot. So if you have the image of ballot 192, you can see a vote maybe for Smith and Jones and Garcia. You can go to row 192 on the cast vote record and see that votes were recorded for Smith and Jones and Garcia. And then you can add up the columns for Smith and Jones and Garcia and see that they each received the totals that the county reported in the official election results that they received. So with these 4 pieces of information, we have total transparency of the election. We know who was eligible to vote and who voted. We know that there's a ballot image for everyone that voted. And we know that the tabulation spreadsheet on which those votes were tabulated was done correctly. Now, the bill also contains several aspects of making sure that we are protecting personally identifiable information. There are protected voters in Arizona, judges, police officers, battered women or spouses, and those groups of voters are not obviously listed by name in the first 2 lists. They're just listed as a group. Statewide, for example, we probably have about 7,000 or 8,000 protected voters out of 4.3 million. So there's groups of voters that will be reported in just a number, a combined number. The ballot images, again, are anonymous. You cannot tell from either the ballot image or the cast vote record who voted how. And there will be mechanisms in the law that we're negotiating right now with Republicans and Democrats to make sure that small precincts or ballot styles that are used by very small groups of voters in rural areas, or a street lighting precinct or whatever, that those can be consolidated with larger precincts so that you cannot tell who voted how. But the goal of these bills, and my commitment, as I've said publicly, is that I want 2/3 to 3/4 support of the Republicans in the House and the Senate and the Democrats in the House and the Senate. And that's the only way. In Arizona, we just elected a Democrat governor, but we kept the House and the Senate in Republican-controlled hands by very narrow majorities, 1-vote margins in each body. And that's almost exactly the way I had it when I was Senate president in 2003, 4, 5, and 6, and Janet Napolitano was our governor. The way we made that work is I had to respect that she needed to get a majority of the Democrat caucuses to support the budget or significant pieces of legislation. And she reciprocated by respecting that I had to get, or wanted to get, a majority of the Republicans to support those same ideas. And if a majority of both caucuses supported an idea, the Democrat governor signed them. And that's right back where we are 20 years later. I started as Senate president in 2003. Now in 2023, I find myself back in the state Senate working along these bipartisan lines. But we have got to be able to show people that the elections were done correctly, that they are transparent, trackable, and publicly verified. And I'll shut up and go to the next question.
John?
I don't know what to say. He always says it's so good. That's why I love working with Ken, because he's a very much a principled Republican. And this bill is vital for Arizona. We were the worst, no doubt. We had 43 lawsuits. The next state only had 28. Okay, and so basically, what we're trying to do is, as Ken said, make elections transparent, trackable, publicly verified, with a ballot index library system, because we want even the most doubters to be able, when we do a state audit, which is the second bill we're proposing, that they can do an audit of their own precinct, because it would be released by precinct. And the first thing we'd want them to do is to say, okay, how many voters did you have? Oh, 800. Okay, do you have 800 images? See what I'm saying? You know, and then after they do an audit, it's very easy to take the cast vote record database and convert it into a ballot image audit database. And you can hyperlink in the images. You could do every one, or you could do every 20, and then you could do your own addition. And then when you get done, if it adds up perfect, which it will, because these machines, they do not count your ballot. They count the picture that it made. These pictures are, the system wouldn't work. I mean, in Massachusetts, they're destroying these images because they say it's illegal to have them. So they say they turned it off. Well, turning it off is not a good process, because the system won't work unless it creates an image. They're destroying public records that can prove that elections are real. And that is bad. And what's bad about it is our country is in a crisis. Okay, a crisis of, do we believe we have a functioning democracy or not? And this is not exclusive to MAGAs. In our country right now, in the 2020 election, you know, the MAGAs claim, my God, there are more people voted than are registered to vote in this country. Well, I got bad news. Okay, in that election, 80 million people didn't vote. And that was the highest turnout in 120 years. And the danger behind all of this is incredible. When we started out, 50 million Americans believed that the election was stolen from Trump. I think it's down to 40 million now. Okay, we got a ways to go. And the way we can convince people is with facts. You know, when I was inside the Maricopa audit, and you know, hey, I call it a fraudit. Okay, I knew Ken beforehand. we had a good conversation, and I said, here's my mission. And I wasn't his first choice. I probably was number 4 or 5 on the list because it was completely being boycotted by Democrats. And that really bothered me. And what bothers me is that ignoring people who are in crisis, who are believing grifters, is not a solution. These people are our families. I have 2 brothers and a sister that are QAnon, okay? And believe that something is really wrong. And so basically, it is important for us to understand and help people understand, because it's better to understand than be understood as a person who would follow a guy with an orange face. I'll leave it at that.
You're on mute,
Uh-oh.
John. There you go.
Leah, any comments or questions to address to these bipartisan brothers in the same foxhole?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for all of the work that you do in trying to ensure the integrity and transparency of elections. I guess one question that I have is, John, just to jump off of your, well, I'll offer a couple observations and then a question. To jump off of your observations about kind of the transparency and the facts elements of this, I do think one thing that's important for us all to kind of start from is a diagnosis around the fact that a lot of these claims around voter fraud have been with us for a long time. And they're often like pretty directly related to the enfranchisement of Black people and the Voting Rights Act, and a general perception that when we're talking about voter fraud, or rather when we're talking about kind of the Republican claims of voter fraud, historically what we are talking about is kind of a coded allegation that the wrong people are voting, right? And, that has taken different forms over the years, right? I remember the election of Barack Obama and a mini series of controversies over voter fraud that then sparked a series of Tea Party voting restriction legislation in the states, which was in many ways kind of the spiritual origins or the historical origin or the origin story of a lot of the legislation that's come out on voter restrictions over the last couple of years. All of which is just to say that I think there's one piece of this is very important, which is the actual transparency and integrity of elections, right? And then there's another piece of this that's about the deeper stories that are animating people such that they are vulnerable to the kinds of claims around election fraud that have fueled the big lie, right? And I think that can't really be separated from our perspective from a Trumpist movement that is structured around right-wing grievance, that is structured around kind of convincing a set of people that their country is being taken away from them. And when they think about their country being taken away from them, they often think about that in terms of kind of racial and cultural and gender grievances. All those things I think are pretty tightly linked. And so I guess my question is, how do you translate kind of the accurate information piece of this into countering that deeper story that people are often tapping into when they believe things about elections being stolen?
Well, for me, that's a pretty simple answer, okay, is that transparency is a solution. And I know that, let's say, for example, that with the MAGA movement, these people are very much entrenched, okay? And, you're not going to deal with them in a huge group because it's groupthink going on. And there's groupthink going on in our U.S. government, in the Senate and the House of the U.S., and in Arizona. And so we have to be able to build relationships and start working with people, and you got to win their hearts and minds, okay? And then you have to be able to really understand elections. I used to be a psychotherapist, and when I was inside that fraud, 3,000 people went through there, and I'm a talker. And I like to get 1 or 2 people at a time, sit down, have lunch, or an opportunity on the floor in a corner to talk and to let them understand my perceptions. And, one of the first things I did when I went into the audit, Maricopa audit, is that I knew the story about the bamboo. And of course, I took that story and pushed it out because supposedly 40,000 ballots were flying in from China. okay, and that it landed in Phoenix, and then it got unloaded, and the people unloaded discovered it, so they had to get a hold of General Flynn, and they sent in 2 people to protect him. You can't believe all the people who believed the story. And, you know, I just knew that being an expert in elections, it was easy for me to myth bust. And all of a sudden, me and Ken are myth busters. We're like that TV show, you know? And because Ken is well understand how elections and what's real or not, and so many myths, but keeping out people like me and Ken, if that audit if we weren't there, it could have been a lot worse in what came out. And so basically, it is a problem, and we have to keep working it. And transparency is the currency of trust. We need to prove to these people, and they need to do it on the smallest denomination we can, which is a precinct. And you know, Leah, I'm a big fan of your group, Indivisible. You guys have helped me in many states. You know, I'm in Florida, Tennessee, North Carolina, California. You know, you'll find me all over the place, you know, fighting this battle and trying to teach people that transparency is the solution to a very complex system. And you know, I'll say this, I think we've had some of the best security in elections in many, many years in the last couple of years. But my God, they screwed up. They shut down the transparency. They blocked people, okay? And doing that only spreads conspiracies. And so we have to work together to defeat that. And then we have to go, and what we're trying to do in Arizona, if this thing passes by April, May, we get our governor to sign it, we're going to take it national. And I'm counting on groups like your group, Leah, and other groups that are listening to this. I did post in the chat box that you can watch what happened in our meeting. There's a paper I posted that will explain what we're doing. And all I know is we're pushing a lot of hope, because this is what this country needs. It's elections that we all can believe in. And that is our goal. And by doing that, maybe we can also deal with the problem with the Mark Twain party. You know, there is, I think, a secret party out there. And that party believes what Mark Twain said a long time ago. If voting made a difference, they wouldn't let me do it. Let's do it. So why vote? It doesn't mean anything. When did elections ever really change this? We all know people who say that. We know people who don't vote because they don't believe it's real. Hey, maybe if we could prove it, maybe we'd get better candidates. Maybe more people might vote.
Thanks, John. Ken, how do you respond? That's a great answer. And how do you respond to Leah's question that really having to do with voter suppression?
Well, I respond by saying that transparency is how you translate. It's very hard to translate something you can't see. So if you want to translate what's going on in elections to address the concerns that Leah and Indivisible and many others are concerned about, or having to defend against claims that, you know, the wrong people are voting, that's what the two lists do. Here's the list of who's eligible, and here's the list of the people that voted, and everybody who voted was eligible. And we, at least at that point, repel this idea that there's a bunch of people coming in and voting who shouldn't, and or if there are people that are being discriminated against as far as getting on the voter rolls or should be eligible to vote, or once they get on those rolls are not being allowed to vote, that can come out in those two lists as well. So one of the biggest problems we have on the deniers of election results is that when they challenge things in court, most judges are saying you don't have any proof. And so how can I adjudicate your case? But if they can't see the ballot images, if they can't see the cast vote record on which the votes from those ballots were added up, now the voter lists are already really, at least in Arizona, are public documents, but you got to pay to get them and all of this stuff. So most most of the people that are trying to discover whether the election was done correctly by challenging it in court are being told, you don't have any evidence on which I can make a decision. Well, the evidence is the ballot images and the cast vote record. And I'll just use an Arizona example. Carrie Lake's campaign, she was the candidate for governor on the Republican side. Carrie Lake's campaign needs to see the ballot images so that she can see the 120,000 ballots where voters were voting for example, a Republican named Kimberly Yee for state treasurer, who did not run her campaign based on the MAGA message, but just one of, I'm going to do the best as a state treasurer. Carrie Lake's campaign needs to see whether or not there's 120,000 ballots where the voter voted for Republican Kimberly Yee for state treasurer and did not vote for Carrie Lake for governor. And that's exactly what happened. In Arizona, if you were running on the message of trying to overturn the 2020 election or this, the whole, basically the MAGA movement, if you were too far right on the MAGA movement, those voters that George and others were describing said, no, we're not going to give you our permission to represent us in this republic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I believe that the way to translate, Leah, the way to translate into answers on either side is the transparency. You cannot translate something you can't see. And so we're looking for data that allows people to see where they blew it.
Leah,
Well, thank you, Ken.
Just one, any further comment or follow-up, Leah, before we move on?
Well, I think it's a big ecosystem and we all play different roles. What I would say is I think it's pretty hard to get at these questions without thinking deeply about kind of what is disinformation? How is it created? Why is it created? How does it spread? And why does it appeal to people? And we actually run a disinformation fighting program as part of Indivisible, where we work with volunteers all over the country to first, we work with some people who are in the disinformation space to identify threads of disinformation that are getting a lot of pickup in the right wing and kind of making that jump into mainstream prominence, come up with crafted messaging that's designed to question the sources by people in uncommon values and dispute the fact at hand. And then we basically equip thousands of volunteers with that content so that they can then disseminate it out into their personal networks. And we train folks on kind of like how and why do you counter disinformation? And I think the bottom line for us is, we really have to think about this in terms of like, why is it appealing to people as much as what is the actual factual basis for it and how do we dispute that factual basis, right? Because there will never be a shortage, the fact of the reality, like a fact of reality is great. And also there are a bunch of bad actors out there who are constantly coming up with new stories. And the idea that we will successfully come up with a new piece of a new plan to dispute and guarantee the integrity of every individual bad story they can come up with, when some don't even have a basis in reality to begin with, I think that's challenging. I think we have to go for the underlying heuristics that people have in their heads that make them vulnerable to this kind of disinformation. And so that's really about kind of one, connecting on core values, and then two, planting that seed of why is this spreading? Why are the people in power trying to make me believe this? What advantage do they get out of it? Right. A lot of the work that I think needs to be done here that makes people less fertile targets for this kind of information has to do with kind of that deeper set of attitudes. And I want to call out, there's a comment from Dahana Rice in the chat box around whether the election denial is kind of caused by the impending majority of youth Black and brown voters. I think those two things cannot be separated. Like fundamentally, a lot of what we're seeing here is the reaction of people who feel like they're losing control of the country, and not necessarily a legitimate concern about the actual specifics of how an election is conducted. And the way that we get at that is by adopting the kinds of frames that buy more people into a multiracial pluralistic democracy, right? I am going to take this opportunity to shout out my absolute favorite set of academics and thinkers on this topic. If you have not read Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us, which is an incredibly powerful book about essentially the push for a multiracial democracy, how that's affected us economically, how that's affected us politically. If you haven't read Ian Haney Lopez's Merge Left, which is specifically about this question of how do you actually build a multiracial collective, there are two incredibly strong books that really talk about this question of how do we actually become the multiracial collective that we have always promised to be, while also recognizing that this tide of right-wing, often white grievance, sometimes other cultural grievances, has been a present dynamic within our country for a really long time. And so fundamentally, I think that we absolutely should be thinking about, what are the ways in which we insulate the system from predictable attacks. And also, we can't, we have to be real about building the actual political power and building the community ties and shared consensus of a large number of people to be resilient to this kind of disinformation.
I can't agree with you more, Leah, about the underlying issues. And I think that I don't think that there's an argument that ultimately succeeds without an acknowledgement of the truth. The fact of the matter is, America is changing. The fact of the matter is that the multicultural aspect of America is a reality. It can't be denied. It can't even be defended against. And if we start acknowledging the truth of people's fears, I think we can begin to go even deeper as to what the fear represents. What's the loss? What's the benefit? There are plenty of examples of countries in the world, not plenty, there are enough examples of countries in this world who have made that transition. And the minority, what was the majority, has not been eradicated. They have not been put in jail. They have not lost their rights. It's just a different way of experiencing life. And I think the problem that those of us on the side of multicultural democracy, one of the mistakes we make is pretending that those fears are not real and we don't address them. If the conversation could become a lot more transparent, I think we could make a difference.
Well, and if I could say, as society changes, if there's not transparency as to the fact that those changes are being reflected in people's votes, and for example, in Arizona, we used to be 7 to 8 points advantage to Republicans over Democrats. And you didn't have to do much to win an election as a Republican in Arizona because you had a 7 or 8 point advantage to start with. That's now narrowed to 3 or 3.5. And we used to have 1.5% voters in Arizona who didn't register either Democrat or Republican. Now the independent bloc is the second largest bloc in Arizona. Arizona is 34% Republican, 33% independent, 31% Democrat, and about 1 to 2% everyone else. And so as society changes, if voters who used to think my Republican candidate always wins, or my whatever should always win, when that stops happening and you start to have, wait a minute, a Democrat just got elected. I mean, Janet Napolitano, I've talked about working with Janet Napolitano as Senate president. When she got elected in 2003 in Arizona, it was by 10,000 votes. That's less than the Katie Hobbs victory over Kerry Lake of 17,000 votes last November. As societies change, if there's not transparency for the voters to see and have it proven to them almost that that change is being reflected in the accurate and real elections of people that I might disagree with, they just stand on their soapboxes and yell, somebody must have counted the votes wrong because my person lost. And as society changes, it's that transparency that allows people to accept those changes, Leah, I think.
Good point, Ken. John, you're working on these issues. Actually, let me back up a moment. Leah, because then I'll go back to John and see how this connects. You've talked about you're working on disinformation campaigns. What are your other plans going forward for 23 and 24? Because I want to begin to see how what Ken and John are doing and what you're doing, where the Venn diagram may or may not be here as they look to move this into the world. And I think as they address the questions you're asking from their perspective.
Thank you for that question. I think it's very good. We're
John,
gonna-
let me go to Leah first, and then
Okay,
you
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Well, absolutely. Well, we have tried to build a little bit on a longer term horizon, having started as a resistance movement, which was all very rapid response. What terrible thing is happening now? How do we spring into action? We're now looking at longer term questions about how do we build the kind of inclusive democracy that we all deserve. We're still in defense on some fronts, right? So I think there's a really important piece of the work in the coming years that really for us is about the new conditions in Washington, holding down the harm that a radical MAGA majority in the House is capable of inflicting, avoiding things that would be crises, like, for example, defaulting on the US debt because the MAGA majority is trying to take it hostage. So working really closely with our groups, indivisibles in districts that are represented by Republicans, and particularly Republicans in swing districts, to make sure that there's a lot of pressure coming up from the ground from the very beginning to avert those kinds of very, very dangerous outcomes. Working with our folks in blue states around how do Democrats present a really compelling story to the American people, one that unites a powerful, a strong economic agenda that's really rooted in concern for people's personal well-being, a really forthright defense of our rights and our democracy, and the clarity that we saw in 2022 that helped us outperform what we expected about what is at stake for our rights and our democracy when we are going to vote. All of that is going to be kind of that's our traditional bread and butter work. We're also working on some stuff that I'm really excited about in terms of making sure that we get the word out. When good legislation passes in Washington, we make sure that people actually understand what it is, why it's happening, and how they can take advantage of it and how it can change their life. We know this is a long-term gap in terms of how people experience government, right? Sometimes government does something that is good. Nobody knows that it happened. Nobody hears about it. And that gap between people's kind of overall faith in what government is doing and the reality can grow in that space. And so we're thinking about, in particular, looking at some of the legislation that has happened in the last couple of years. The Inflation Reduction Act, game-changing investments in green energy, in infrastructure, in jobs, in healthcare, lower healthcare costs. Do people know about it? Not really, according to the polling. So we are looking at how do we actually close that gap between great legislation happening and people understanding why it is happening and how they personally benefit from it. We are obviously a movement that is really made up of people who are based in their communities around the country. And so that's not, it doesn't look like slick political messaging, because it's not. It's coming from neighbors. It is coming from people who you know in your community. And so we're thinking about how do we actually empower this army of citizen ambassadors with information that helps to build faith in what government can do. So that's one initiative that we're excited about developing and rolling out this year. The other thing that we're looking to do is to go deeper in a set of states where democracy really is under threat. So Arizona being one of them, we really want to continue to work and bolster and strengthen the Indivisible movement, the groups who have been doing this work on the ground in Arizona for a long time, recognizing that ultimately, there are a set of states that are going to continue to face these challenges over both the rules of the game, right? These struggles over the actual mechanics by which elections are conducted, who makes those decisions, who holds the power, how are they administered at the county office, all of the county level, all of that above. And also the broader political fight, right? Around actually just who won the most votes. Indivisibles are ready to be part of both of those. So we just want to continue to strengthen the network so that we can really be there when we are needed for both the crises moments and the moments when it's about getting everybody to the polls.
Thank you. Before we go over to John's response here, Leah, if somebody watching or listening wants to find out how they can join their local Indivisible group, I suspect they just go to the website and do it, but could you say that from your
That is right. That is correct. Yes, we have a website. We have local Indivisible groups all over the country. There's a map. Go on, log on, check out the places that might be nearest to you. If you enter your zip code, you can probably find it. If you want to sign up for our email list, we offer regular updates on what is happening in Washington and what you can do to make your voice heard that are targeted to your specific location. So it's about, you are represented by this person. Here are the things you can do. And yeah, we always want to be in conversation with potential new activists.
So I think one thing we want to do before John responds is we want the individual chapters in Arizona to really get behind Ken Bennett, not only just what's happening in the state legislature, but really acknowledging somebody like him as a principled Republican, so much working on behalf of our democracy. So anyway, a little bit of a challenge to you on that one. John Brakey.
Yes, thank you. I don't know. I agree with Leah with everything she's saying. I mean, we're on the same page, and I guess we're in the same tribe because we live in a tribal country. One thing I do want to point out that I'm going to put this paper, I'm going to put it there because it has a lot of great links. And I just want to read one thing that I think is very important. It's in my document because, I figure our country is in a lot of despair. And it says, let us not despair, but act. Let us not seek the Republican answer or the Democratic answer, but the right answer. Let us not seek to fix the blame for the past. Let us accept our responsibility for the future. John F. Kennedy, one of my, I was a young man when he died, but it affected my life, and his brother did. And so the point I'm trying to say is this right here. We want to work with everybody. We are nonpartisan. I put links in the chat that you'll see that Adrian Fontes, I think everybody knows who Adrian Fontes, Secretary of State, he's with us. After Ken presented the bill, there was Adrian Fontes right there. And I want you to know that we can go to Maryland, the whole state, and download those images, okay? Half the state of Florida you can get. The other half I'm suing, okay? Because they won't release. And, destroying public records that could prove that elections are real is a real problem, okay? Because what are they hiding? And I'll say this, I don't think that there's a big fraud thing going on, but I do think that nobody likes to show their underwear. And I think that they're dirty underwear, and images will show if they're not doing electronic adjudication, you will find votes that weren't counted properly, okay? Because people, when they fill out a ballot, sometimes circle the ballot, circle the oval. And if you do that, your vote don't count. Sometimes you put a hesitation mark down and you write in the big bubble, you fill it in and say, I want this, and it's called an overvote. There's ways, very simply, that we can prove, in the paper that I'm putting out there, we have a link, close elections, convincing the losers that they really lost. I think that's a good idea, okay? Fighting disinformation. This is what this stuff will do, okay? We got Wisconsin, a couple of counties there. When I was there in 2016, I audited, we convinced the largest county in the state to release, and they are. And it's working. The whole state of Georgia, we just got them to go. I'm like Johnny ballot seed, for the images, around the country. I'm out here. I teach 7 C's. What are those C's? Character, capacity, credibility, civility. I can call you bad names real nicely if I use civility, citizenship, country. But to me, the big one is courage. Courage to stand up, sometimes all by yourself. But when you do, think this: what kind of a character has the capacity to have an adrenaline surge and say something really stupid? Because you know what? The real big asset that I have and Ken has and people on this call is character. What kind of a character has the capacity to do something like that? I don't want you joining my group. I want to teach you how to form your own little group. I think Margaret Mead was right. A few committed citizens can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing it ever has. And so I'm out here inspiring people and teaching them how to look at elections difference and realize that the problems in elections are complicated. But my God, the solutions are damn simple. And it's called transparency, which again is the currency of trust. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
I can't agree more with all of the work that each one of you does in your own lanes to help make democracy better. The transparency aspect of relationships, the kind of in-depth work, Leah, that you do. And at the same time, I have this odd belief system. And my odd belief system is that the ultimate power of democracy rests in the power, what I call the power of one. And that is the inalienable rights that each individual citizen has an obligation, a responsibility, and the potential of exercising. So what I want to know from you is, what else can we do, not just in election cycles, not just with ballots, not just with organizing groups to have greater transparency in their voting and whatnot? What can we do to fully remind the American citizen what the full scope of their rights are, and how they can exercise them with their dollars, with their protests, with all of the different ways, their attention and whatnot? Because it seems to me that until we activate citizens, not just every 2 to 4 years, but every single day of the week, to do what they can as citizens to make a difference, we're always going to be playing from behind. So, could you share a little bit about that aspect of this with me?
Leah, you want to?
Sure, absolutely. Well, a huge part of our theory within Indivisible is that the best way to keep people, well, first of all, I just want to enthusiastically endorse the point. Part of the problem that we are facing as a country is that we have kind of evolved this infrastructure where we ask people for money and we ask them for votes, and we don't ask them for active engagement as citizens most of the time every year. And not surprisingly, that breeds the kind of cynicism where we end up with low voter participation rates and a general sense of disenfranchisement and disconnection from government. Part of the core thinking within Indivisible is getting people into community with each other in person in ways where they find out how much power they actually have, from everything from the local level to the national level, is part of the solution here. And that can't be like all driven by nonprofits, right? Like that has to be led by regular people all over the country who want to be part of those kinds of communities where we believe in our own power, we believe in our own efficacy, and we seek out those ways to make a difference together. So that's really kind of a core part of our own mission. And so part of my answer here is, I do think that so much of what we have power over in our own lives is our relationships and our own time commitments, right? So who do you know in your network who can be moved to a different place And also, where are you personally putting your own time and energy in terms of those commitments beyond the election cycle, right? And who are you pulling with you when you do that? So not to be one note, but I strongly advise, it does not have to be an indivisible group, but if you are not connected with an in-person community that is dedicated to action on an issue that is important to you, on the broader set of questions around democracy in our country, I think the best thing that you can do is figure out how do you form those ties in your community, because that's sustainable in a way that often digital stuff is not. And because I think we often mistake kind of active engagement with the news, like reading a lot of news, as political activism, and it's not, right? Actual doing things is activism. And so what we need to do is create those kinds of communities and those kinds of ties where we're moving more people into action, and we're creating that virtuous loop where they see the results and they feel empowered, and that urges them on to more.
Thank you. And Ken, how do you respond to Leah's question in terms of both a broader exercise of our citizenship, but a sense of the responsibility of what it means to be a citizen?
Well, I was thinking more along what George was asking. I appreciate Leah's input, but I think it's kind of going at the same place. And I'm looking at some chats over here. One was focused on peace, another's focused on truth, another's focused, won't find that one there, but courage. I'm an Eagle Scout, and I think it's the 7th part of the Scout law. Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind. It's number 6. I'm sorry, kind. And eventually, I think the underlying thing that solves this problem, and people being able to work together, solve problems, even though they have different perspectives, is the word love. But when you say love, it's just so far away from where people on opposite ends of a political discussion, or I don't know that they can get to love yet, but that's where we got to eventually get to. But we've got to be able to talk to each other instead of talking at each other. We got to be able to listen with the intent to understand where the other person's coming from. We've got to be able to be civil. I love John's C's, but we have to be able to. So I kind of come back to my Boy Scout training: trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind. Courteous is not a bad one right before it. Obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. We've got to be able to just be human beings next to each other working on these problems. We got to quit throwing rocks at each other and assuming that somebody disagrees with my position, they're a bad person. I voted for Donald Trump twice. And, I've heard a lot about on this conversation, efforts to push back against his philosophy or whatever. But John Brakey's a bigger, who's the guy that ran for president, John, that you supported? Can't think of his name right now, just drew a blank. But
Yeah.
John Brakey and I will probably never vote for the same person for president. Neither will Leah and I. But dang it, I want Leah's vote to count. I want John's vote to count. I want the black 18-year-old who's registering to vote for the first time in Arizona or New Mexico or North Carolina or wherever. I want them to know that their vote counts. And it was counted as they cast it. And if we all allow kindness and humanity to the other people that we live on this planet together with, we'll solve problems such as climate. We'll solve problems such as clean water. We'll solve problems such as whatever it is, crime and immigration, and we'll solve all kinds of problems if we're just working together. But if we're throwing up walls and throwing rocks, lobbing them over the walls, hoping they hit somebody on the other side, we won't get anything done.
Thank you. That is great, Ken. And I want to bring love into the conversation, because we were part of some conversations years ago with folks on very opposite sides of the divide. In fact, there was one meeting we did when Al Gore was out there selling his documentary An Inconvenient Truth, and we brought Al and his critics together. But the two sides of love that everybody could agree on. Everybody loves the country. And to hear everybody's own description, not only of their love of the country, but their history of coming really to fall in love with the country with all of its warts, was remarkable. And we all love our families. We all share common loves, I think, at the personal level and almost the transcendent level. And I think how we bring heart politics, as a friend of mine used to describe it, into this abyss, which is people getting to know each other, is one of our challenges. And last night, dear friend of ours from Florida, Liz Joyner, who does a series of webinars, had a man on by the name of Daryl Davis. Curious if anybody on the screen has ever heard of him. So that I won't go into the story because it's worth looking at. Remarkable Black musician all of his life. And the first time he experienced prejudice, the question that came to his mind is about a very young boy. How can somebody who doesn't know me hate me?
Yeah.
And that was an animating question for his life. And
that's the only way you can hate someone, John. That's the only way you can hate someone, is to not know them.
And so what he did is, by chance, he met one of the grand dragons of the Ku Klux Klan, and they entered into a relationship. And over time, they got to know each other and respect each other. And this grand dragon, not only did he leave the Klan, he shut down his Klan, his particular chapter, when he left. So meanwhile, Davis has met with hundreds of members of the Ku Klux Klan and went to Ku Klux Klan rallies that were public, so he knew he was going to be safe. And he's written a book, which I think is called Beyond Hate. I think he did a TED Talk. But I think so much of what we're talking about is this personal level of relationship. And I mean, talk about somebody with courage. Although he said he never was afraid in these situations. But as you're talking, Ken, that's how I respond. Because Hannah Arendt, the great German-American philosopher years ago, said, democracy needs a place to sit down. We've lost our places to sit down. We've lost public places where it's safe for you and Leah, although we're creating a safe place here, to have this conversation. But we don't have places like that with a set of protocols and shared values of what it takes to enter the doors. The only place we have like this, where we've been trying it, are libraries. But it's almost like we need democracy-safe spaces in every town and village in this country, so people who do want to meet the other and move beyond hate and prejudice because they didn't know the other, is to do exactly what you're talking about. So I just want to really honor the democracy space you're holding and what we need to do to really transform this country. So thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
John. I think it's also important. Leah referenced it when she talked about communities, is that we could also do a better job by getting together in communities and accomplishing, physically doing activities that advance the well-being of the community, whether it's public service projects or hospital visits or whatever the heck they happen to be. Over the years, I have found that experience produces the common opportunity for people to get over their misconceptions about each other. And if we could create much more of a service concept in America, we could probably eliminate some of the divisions. Jim, why don't you come back in and join us? We're getting close to the end.
And George, what I just to add to that, bless George Bush's attempt to do this with his Points of Light Foundation, exactly what you're talking about. And I think the power of one, when magnified by the power of the group, which is what Leah is talking about, and Ken is talking about in a different way, I think in a way is our way forward.
If I could say, I couldn't agree with you more. I wear a button that says "Be the We." It's purple. If you take red and blue and you put it together, you get purple. We went into that meeting Monday. Oh, yeah. We went into that meeting.
He is wearing purple too.
Yeah. Ken Bennett spoke first, well-known Republican, former Secretary of State, Democratic Secretary of State. And, you know, we went into a room that was highly partisan. 4 Democrats sit on one side, 6 on the other, and it doesn't look like they like each other, okay? It's a big group thing. It's a minor minority, okay? You know, to pass a bill in this state, you need 16 votes out of 30 in the Senate. You need 31 out of the House out of 60, and you need a governor. And they don't got a governor to pass a bill. And so hardball is being played, okay? You can see the 4 Democrats. And by the way, it came out in that hearing that this really wasn't a Republican bill. Believe it or not, we in 2010, my lawyer and me and others, passed a resolution in the Democratic Party, which is part of our platform, that we want to do this. And then you could see when that came out, and you could see the 4 Democrats starting to melt their position after hearing. There was the League of Women voter there. She was going to vote against it and stand up. But after she heard Ken, and after she heard Adrian Fontes, and just before she called her, she got out of the room, because I know she's going to change and come over, because they're starting to understand. And so that's what we're doing out here. We're teaching people that it's better to understand than be understood. And we need to get them to have dialogue with each other, and they need to practice civility like never before and find common ground. And when we go into these legislative periods, we can find people on the other side. There is a huge split in the Republican Party, okay? And Ken is trying to take his party back. He's a principled Republican, and I'm here to help him, because we do need a system with checks and balances. Yeah, I'll be honest. I wish we had ranked choice voting, because, you know, I really would like to vote for hope before I die, before I vote for the less of 2 evils, because that seems what it is. But anyway, thank you for having me, and Ken, and yeah.
Well, George said something. Someone said something about the one person. Nothing matters until it gets down to the one. Someday, an election is going to be decided by one vote. In Arizona, we had our attorney general race, statewide attorney general race, and it was 511 votes out of over 2.3 million votes was the difference between the winner or the loser. They did an automatic recount. It came down to 280. Someday, there's going to be a major race decided by one vote, and it's going to be the Black 18-year-old kid that registered on the last day eligible, or it's going to be the Hispanic girl who did the same thing. And we're going to all realize that nothing matters but the one. And then we're all going to have to acknowledge, but that election is going to have scrutiny like you wouldn't believe. They're going to want to recount and recount and recount to make sure that somebody really won by one vote. And then we'll all have to stand back and look at each other and say, maybe it was your vote, or maybe it was her vote, or maybe it was his vote. But we are all going to live with that decision because of one person. And that's the only way you change the world, is one person at a time.
Yep. And that video is in the link now, convincing the loser they lost, and they used an example of one vote.
Well, thank you. I applaud your efforts, and I think I only have one question, in part because of the time constraints, but I'd like to start with you, Ken. As a Republican leader, given the turbulence of the 2020 election and the denial that came out of it, the battles that were fought in the 22 election between the climate deniers and so forth, in your view, have we kind of gotten beyond that? And is the Republican Party slowly moving beyond the election denial and therefore the election suppression, as you seem to be in Arizona? Or do you see increasing polarization in the Republican Party itself about the integrity of elections? I mean, it seems to me that one scenario is that your vote, your bill passes, the 4-part bill, which I think every county and state in the United States should adopt. Do you think that will ameliorate that?
Yes, absolutely.
In the Republican Party or not?
It will. It may be the only thing that does. Right now, as I was listening to your question, right now we're still way too polarized in the Republican Party. We've got about half of the party that believes the elections of 2020 and 2022 were stolen. And there's the other half that says, no, I can't quite go there. But until we provide the transparency for people to see how voters voted and that they were added up correctly on that cast vote record, we will continue that polarization. That's why we're running this bill. Transparency is the solution. And the polarization will pull farther and farther apart.
Right.
Until we can allow people to see the ballots without knowing who voted which way, and see the tabulation spreadsheet on which it was added up.
Yeah, and I think so your sense is that it's still an uphill battle in Arizona to get the bill passed, and for the kind of the Republican Party or the climate or the election deniers to relax into another level of trust and transparency for the process.
Well, it's both. Even though I think the big divide is within my party, the Republicans, I have yet to get a Democrat to vote for the bill.
Really?
It passed the House Elections Committee, 6 Republicans for, 4 Democrats against. So far, as the bill has been debated in the Senate Elections Committee that I'm on, there's 4 Republicans supportive, 3 Democrats opposing.
Wow.
Now, why would the Democrats oppose a bill like this?
I don't know yet, but I think it has to do with some other things that are going on in a legislative body that is the House and the Senate are each controlled by Republicans by 1 vote. I think we just elected a Democrat governor though, and we are learning how to work in a shared, some call it divided government, I call it shared government. And both parties are still learning. And I am longing, praying, hoping, expecting. One thing that came out of the 6-4 vote in the House, one of the 4 Democrats came up to me immediately after the vote, and she said, I want to be in a working group to work through some of the questions and concerns that I have. And I think you can get me. And when I get 1, I'll get 2, and then I'll get 4, and then I'll get 8. And I want this bill, I don't want this bill to pass if it only passes with Republican votes.
Mhm.
I want this bill to pass with 3/4 of the Democrats in support and 3/4 of the Republicans in support in both the House and the Senate. If it doesn't happen that way, then we got to figure out how to make it happen that way, because then, only then, can we send it up to the 9th floor and have a Democrat governor say, I agree, let's do it. And as John mentioned, right after a former Republican Secretary of State, myself, and now Republican Senator spoke in support of the bill, so far the one Democrat that has had the, I call it courage and integrity, to say this is a good idea is Adrian Fontes, the current Secretary of State. Adrian Fontes and I might not agree on many things, but we agree that we've got to be able to prove to people that the election was added up correctly and the people's votes were counted, and losers have to know that they lost and winners can be comforted that they won. And the resistance so far is coming from Democrats. And I thank God for Adrian Fontes' courage so far, because he's the only one. But he won't be the only one. By next week, we'll have 2 or 3. And then the next week, we'll have 10. Then the next week, we'll have 20. And then we'll be ready to go.
Well, Leah, maybe Indivisible should get in there and help Ken.
Yeah, I'd have to know a lot more about the legislation for that to be
I told you,
something that
see?
we would get in. No, well, I'll be honest. Look, I'm having a little bit of a challenge here because I do think that it's really important. Let me just say, it's really important that there are people on all sides of the political aisle who are invested in getting back to a place in our democracy where we argue about issues, but we don't argue about the rules of the game, right? Like, and so I think we can all be here together agreeing that, like, I can't wait to get to the place where I can be arguing with Ken about immigration or about, schools or about abortion, the right to an abortion, instead of arguing about whether or not every vote should be counted, or instead of arguing, like us both being on the same side is the argument about whether we're going to actually be a democracy or not. So I think that is really important. And also, fundamentally, I think we have to grapple with the reality that part of this is not about the actual ability to guarantee transparency. Part of this is about the fact that there's a powerful faction within the Republican Party that is really committed to advancing this narrative because it is electorally beneficial to them within the Republican Party, right? And I really salute the people within the Republican Party who are pushing back on that, because fundamentally, that's something that's got to be solved within the Republican Party. Like, how do we actually get to the place where we have 2 parties that are in their leadership, both committed to democracy again? Our contribution in the meantime often is about kind of creating an electoral penalty for advancing these kinds of conspiracy theories. So making sure that when folks like Adrian Fontes' opponent run, that they actually suffer a meaningful electoral penalty for being affiliated with the election denial movement. And those are the pieces that we work together on.
Now, the 3 most important words in the Pledge of Allegiance I say every morning. Are you ready? Republic, indivisible, and God.
And Ken, I really admire and respect your desire to have 3/4 of the members of both parties endorse this bill. And if it is really a good bill and it does what you and John agree and believe that it will, pass it anyway, and people will fall in line because they'll understand its value. So that's just a piece of advice from an old political operative.
And Leah, I look forward to your learning the details of the bill to actually see if Indivisible in Arizona will get behind it. And I think that's a major takeaway from our panel this morning. Do I hear you committed, you or Ezra or your leaders in Arizona being committed to doing that?
So we take our guidance from Indivisibles in Arizona. And so I would be happy to learn more about what the Indivisible groups in Arizona's analysis of the bill. We have an amazing Indivisible state legislature group called Civic Engagement Beyond Voting. They do in-depth analysis of basically everything that's happening at the Arizona state legislature.
If you are not signing up for our email list, but you are interested in Arizona state politics, strongly advise you to go to their website and sign up because they send out a wonderful set of emails and analysis.
So
I
maybe,
would heavily defer to them.
and you would encourage them to meet with Ken?
Please.
I look, we're an alliance of people. I am sure they are curious to learn more about anything that is moving in the Arizona legislature. I fully trust their analysis and I fully trust their situational context.
Do you know Jennifer
We're,
Tanner?
we're almost there.
Okay. All righty.
Leah, do you know Jennifer Tanner?
Excuse me?
No, doesn't ring a bell. Jennifer Tanner. She works in
I-
California, Arizona. She's a voter in Arizona.
Maybe I'm not sure if it doesn't immediately ring a bell, but we've got a lot of amazing
Yeah,
leaders. across
she's with Indivisible. a big
Wonderful.
player.
Which group?
Out of Sedona, and I guess a group out of California.
Oh, great. I visited the Sedona group just a couple months ago. They're
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
Mhm.
Sedona's in my district.
We're gonna get this done. Jim?
Yeah, it seems to me, Leah, that given the fact that John and Ken from these very, very different points of view are agreeing on that 4-point bill really warrants Indivisible's attention. I know you have to go from the ground up, but I think that there's something here that if we could pull it off in Arizona, where, as you say, we don't want to keep fighting over the process. We want to settle on the process so we can dialogue on the real issues. And just my intuition based on this conversation is that Ken, I think you've come up with something, and I think it's worthy of the support, at least the scrutiny, the empathetic scrutiny of organizations like Indivisible, because maybe that's the pathway through this thicket, is something that draws on the diversity of the players, focusing on the transparency and integrity of the process in the way that, you as a seasoned member of a state legislature, you've been in the trenches for decades now. You know the game, and I think, where the traction point is to navigate through something that, if not solved, could destroy the republic to which you pledge allegiance every morning. So I think that's
Absolutely
a real opportunity. But anyway, let's see. I'm not sure how to end this. It's such a rich conversation, but I think
I'd like to add one little thing before we end.
Why don't you add a little thing, John, and then Ken
little,
and Leah,
it's
and then
involved
John and George.
The list that Ken's talking about, why do we want it? Is because we're looking at like balancing a checkbook, debit, credit. Most Americans know how to do that, I hope, at least. I've done it 40 some years. My wife's an accountant, okay, so I'm taking denial on that. But that in the voter list, there are two lists. There is an active list and there is an inactive list. In that voter list, the first one they got to put out, they have to put the inactive voters in it, because the inactive voters is 10%, and they don't show it. When Maricopa claims they had an 81% turnout, no, they didn't. They had a 72%, but they had some precincts that went 100% or close to it. And you know what people said? Ha ha, fraud. See, that proves it. You can't have 100%. Well, only if you have 285,000 people on the inactive list in Maricopa, or 50,000 in Pima, and a high turnout election, that creates conspiracies. Okay? Like I said, we're mythbusters. Thank you.
Ken, final word.
Well, thank you for, first of all, thank you for an hour and a half of each of your time, and the many people who are chatting and watching. There's two things that we can give each other. One is love and one is time. And thank you for being with me today, allowing me to be with you. You said, Jim, that, I've come up with this idea Now I find out that John has sneakily already had the idea in 2010. It was part of the Arizona Democrat Party platform, and it took him 13 years to talk me into sponsoring a bill that he already had 13 years, the idea 13 years ago. So I better not take credit for the idea, but all I'll take credit for is working together with people of integrity and people who are honestly trying to make, in John and I's case, Arizona better tomorrow than it was today. And in Leah's 2,600 organizations around the country, people trying to make Sedona or Prescott or Phoenix or Tucson better than it was the day before. Let's just work together, identify the issues, fix the bill, however it needs to be fixed. But the fundamental idea, I think, is a good one. And it needs to spread across this country so that we quit arguing about whether this election was done right or not and get on to the things about how to make America better.
Great, thank you. You're a great Eagle Scout. My God, you're a great Eagle Scout, man. You know, it's so important when we find.
I used to play Grand Funk Railroad too.
I was in a rock band in high school, Eagle Scout in a rock band in high school, and but my favorite title is Papa to my 4 grandchildren. So it all comes back to family. I think John or George said it.
Yeah.
We love our family and we love our country. Let's fix it.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you so much. Leah.
Well, look, I think that, again, like I said, I would love to get to the place where we're not arguing with anyone about whether we're going to be a democracy. We're just having an exchange about different issues. I think that has been, a troubling development over the last near decade at this point, as we're watching this escalation. And I also think we have to recognize those historical roots, right? Like, that's not Donald Trump and the movement there and the election denial crisis of 2020 were not historic. They were not departures, right? They were part of a tradition and a continuation of a historical tradition. And so ultimately, I think we both have to have a common cause of all of us fighting for a shared democracy, fighting for a democracy where we all belong and we're all represented. And doing what is necessary to ensure that that tradition sustains, and also doing the interpersonal work to heal and address some of the inequities that have that have been central to our founding, and doing the interpersonal work to try and address the ways in which these narratives that undergird the election crisis, the election fraud, have been spread and perpetuated. And so fundamentally for us, this is about how do we transform into that inclusive democracy that we know that we ultimately can be together. And I see somebody's popped Prescott Indivisible in the chat. They are one of my favorite Indivisible groups in Arizona. I'm not supposed to have favorites, but they are a great Indivisible group in Arizona. So really strongly encourage, if you are watching from an Arizona side, please sign up for your local Indivisible group there. It's a great network. I know they'd love to hear from you.
By the way, I was just thinking, Leah, obviously we want to support you as you have your baby, but the data shows that your little baby has been listening to what you've been saying this whole time.
Oh yeah, and kicking. I can tell you they're listening.
She's pro-democracy.
Oh yeah.
Okay, Mr. Steiner and then George.
All right, go ahead, John.
Just great conversation, everyone. And echoing Ken, thank you, everybody, for your hour and a half plus of time. It's really a gift to us, to Humanity Rising, to the democracy dialogues, but I think ultimately to our country. So love you all, love our country, and love how we're going to go forward together.
Thank you, John.
Thank you all. I think what we demonstrated today is that it's possible. Let's keep demonstrating this as much as possible. We can get together with different perspectives and points of view. We can deal with one another civilly. We can honor our differences and honor each other. And that's the beginning of the path back. So thank you all very, very much. Blessings.
Thank you all. That brings our session to a close on an inspirational note that despite all our differences, despite our challenges, the viability of democracy in our time is something that will be assured to the degree to which people of goodwill come together to make it so. So I really want to applaud your courage and your integrity, each one of you, in this extraordinary process. This will bring our session to a close. You're all welcome to the after session chat group, and we'll see you all on Monday for a deeper dive into the experience of Black women in a world of race. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.